Good evening. Thank you. My name is Adam Brasich, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Burton Folsom, our speaker tonight. Dr. Folsom is a professor at Hillsdale College of History. He received his bachelor's degree from Indiana University, his master's from the University of Nebraska, and his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He has written numerous books on conservative messages, the most recent being New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America. Please join me in welcoming him to Wabash College.
Thank you. Good. It's great to be here. Of course, I had the misfortune to attend IU and not Wabash. But at least after I graduate, I have a chance to gain some sense with age, right, and get on the Wabash campus. I'd like to thank Adam and Steve Henke and others in the Wabash Conservative Union for inviting me here. And we had a great dinner, and I got a chance to see the campus. I've been here once before, and to see all the fine things you have going here. I teach at Hillsdale College, which is also a liberal arts school, somewhat similar to Wabash. We have about, I'd say 400 or 500 more students than you do here. All of them women. But I do like being here and appreciate your openness to ideas, which are involved with my book, New Deal or Raw Deal, which is on Franklin Roosevelt. The book came out in November 2008. And all of a sudden, some comparisons were raised because of what happened when President Obama came into office. How many have heard Obama make references to Roosevelt in the New Deal? He'll often say this is the greatest flurry of activity that we've had since Franklin Roosevelt, and he reads about Franklin Roosevelt. He's even had a conference at the White House with people who have written on the New Deal to give him advice. And I was neglected. Either that or I've lost my invitation. Somehow missed that, but I'm glad to be here. You can, if any of you see President Obama, you can relay the message to it. I see a couple of comparisons. I wanted to begin with a couple of comparisons. And I also wanted to talk in detail about the New Deal. And in Q&A, if you want to ask about that or other parallels, feel free to do so. But one thing that we see with President Obama and Franklin Roosevelt, they both, of course, are dealing with crises that are in the country, high unemployment. And if we look at the crisis that they were dealing with, sometimes we call this the Great Recession. What Roosevelt was dealing with, the Great Depression. We had greater unemployment in the Great Depression than we did recently. But still, both of those events, if we look at them and look at the parallels, we see that in both cases, this is an important opening point, that government was heavily involved in creating the crisis that those two presidents were then called upon to deal with. In the case of President Obama and the banking crisis that he experienced, we were talking about this at dinner, the Community Reinvestment Act is a critical event, because the Community Reinvestment Act, which was actually passed by President Carter, but it was strengthened under President Clinton in the late 1990s. And that strengthening, it gave incentives for banks, really requirements for banks, to make loans to people who had limited collateral, inadequate collateral to cover the loans under normal circumstances. The idea being that we could spread home ownership. Well, of course, this works all right as long as there's no recession and housing prices keep going up. In the case of the banks, they were happy because they had a federal agency created under Franklin Roosevelt called Fannie Mae, which would agree to buy all of these loans and give the bank the money for the loan. So the bank, see, they'd make the loan and they'd say, normally we would never make this loan, right? This is someone, and we literally got some people who were working at the equivalent of McDonald's buying houses that were $380,000. And they thought normally you would never have on low collateral in a limited job like that, make a loan like that. It would never even be considered. But they're saying, look, we can pass it along to this federal agency, and it's then their responsibility. And so the bank was perfectly willing to do that. Then, of course, when we have the decline in housing prices after being accompanied by the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates, then we have a collapse of housing prices. And then, all of a sudden, people are in default. This is what we call toxic assets. That is what these mortgages were. And then the collapse begins. So we see that a government program mandating low interest loans to people with low levels of collateral is triggering a crisis that we have in the banking system that then President Obama and really President Bush dealt with. Now, the Great Depression, we see a similar situation in that we had some different government agencies, but a similar situation in that you had a government problem. For example, the Federal Reserve in the Great Depression raised interest rates from roughly 3.5% to 6%. That made it harder for people in 1928, 29 to borrow money. So that, and it's also going to reduce the amount of loan payments that you get. So artificially raising the interest rates. Now, the second thing that we did, Milton Friedman, by the way, really made his reputation arguing the case of the poor activity of the Federal Reserve in his monetary history of the United States. The other event, that was a government-triggered event, was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the highest tariff in U.S. history. Now, some of you might think, how is a high tariff necessarily going to cause a depression? In a way, it's sort of simple. We're not going to buy people's imports because we put taxes on them. That's what a tariff is. If we're not going to buy other people's imports, they're not going to buy our exports. Thus, we're going to have businesses that normally had good foreign trade are going to have them collapsed. One illustration might serve the trick. Watches were a major import that we got from Switzerland. And these watches, let's say, are about, back then, about $4 a piece. We doubled the tariff to make them $8 a piece. So you pay the Swiss $4, you pay $4 to the customs service to buy it. Well, people then bought locally. They didn't buy Swiss watches, which were better watches. American watches were not as good. They ran the hour in 58 minutes. Swiss watches, by contrast, kept perfect time. But people wanted the cheaper watches, and they would buy the American watches often because they were so much cheaper. Switzerland all of a sudden can't sell their watches to us. They say, okay, if you're not going to buy our watches, we won't buy your automobiles. Country after country cut off General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, which dominated the world back in 1929, because we refused to buy products, in this case of Switzerland, their watches, but in the case of Britain, blankets, in the case of Spain, olives, and so on, all down the line. My point being, when you lose your export trade, that could be a big hurt. 25% of all agriculture, all of our farming products are export. Well, yeah, we're going to have a collapse of farm prices. Because all of a sudden we have all that glut of product that can't be sold abroad anymore. In the case of the tariffs, we had over 3,200 tariffs put on the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Over 3,200 products that we weren't going to let in many cases with a very high tariff. Automobiles, we sold 5 million in 1929, 1.5 million in 1932. Not all of that was foreign. I don't mean to imply that, but a big chunk of it was. And you can see that that collapse of foreign trade is going to be a problem. So the third problem then is under President Hoover, who was signed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. He then said, oh my gosh, look at this, we're in depression. And he supported a raising